So far, we've talked about what the federal government and in some cases state governments do to put in place the conditions where a capitalist free market system can exist. How it creates the conditions for the owners of capital to actually build large-scale for-profit businesses. Now let's take a look at local government, because in dealing with the growing working class, which is to say a group of people who, because of the dissolution of the traditional household economy, no longer have a livelihood either on the farm or in the household of some master, are now becoming wage workers who have nothing else, no other option to make a living but to hire for wages with somebody. And because the wages are not very high and certainly not sufficient to make a living, and because the jobs are also not sufficient to get everybody who's been kicked out of the old order absorbed into industry, this leads to large-scale misery in the cities. And the local law is there to deal with it, and it deals with it in a punitive, in a repressive kind of fashion. The first important legal instrument here are the vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws are a leftover from the traditional order. In the traditional order, where everybody had a place, everybody belonged someplace, vagrancy was defined as being in a place where you have no business being. So this was used to arrest people who were possibly up to no good because they came from some place and they didn't have a good reason to be in this place. In the 1820s, this becomes the norm for many people. You have no place to be. On the farm, you're no longer part of the household. Or in the city, you no longer live under the master's roof. But you also don't have a job, or you don't have a job that pays for your housing. So you're essentially homeless and or unemployed. But under vagrancy laws, that is precisely a crime. If you can't say this is where I live and this is my business in this place, you are a vagrant, and that means you get to be locked up. So if you're doing what thousands, if not millions of people at this time do, you leave the farm, you go to town or to the big city, you're looking for work, you are a criminal by definition off the bat until you find housing and a job. And that increases the pressure to take any old job and to rent any old place. And that evidently helps those who offer jobs and housing that isn't really all that good. The second thing, and this affects more people who already have an income, is debt imprisonment. This too goes back to the days of the traditional order. A law that says if you don't pay back your debt, you're going to go to jail until you do. At a time when the only people who dealt with large amounts of money and thereby incurred debt, took out a loan, a bill of exchange and whatnot, was merchants, this made sense, because if you were borrowing money, you were a person who had money or had access to money. So if you really didn't give that money back that you owed, chances were you set the wrong priorities, and it would make sense to force you by threatening you with imprisonment to pay back. Now in the 19th century, many more people are starting to deal with cash transactions. And on a small basis, on a small level, like when you go to the grocery store and say, can I maybe keep a tab with you? I need groceries today, but I won't get paid until tomorrow. This becomes something epidemic for the working class, because people do that and then suddenly they don't get called into work, and then rent comes due, and before you know it, you're in default on the debt at the grocery store, And by law, the only thing that can happen at that point is you go to jail until you've repaid it. But how are you going to repay it if the breadwinner of the family is in jail and is prevented from making any money? So this also becomes a point where the man of the house is imprisoned because the family falls back on payments, gets behind on payments, and then it's a death spiral from there because the only income the family had is removed. If people try to improve their situation by joining a union and bargaining as a group of workers with their boss to say either you pay us better or we withhold our labor for you, that is, under new laws that didn't exist in the traditional order, criminalized as a conspiracy to mess with market forces. So it is not just that the law doesn't protect people who might want to form a union, it is that the law makes it a crime to form a union, and that is also enforced. So here is another remedy you might seek to escape the impossibility of your situation as a wage worker, and that is also explicitly blocked by the law. As a result of the above, many people end up becoming cases for charity. If you do, then to take care of you is still a public duty. It is something that the municipalities have to do under the law. The indigent population, people who can't take care of themselves and who would otherwise starve to death, need to be taken care of. So poor houses, like the ones we're reading about, are set up for that purpose. But in order to save money, these are also privatized. So charities like the New York Society for the Prevention of Pauperism and Crime, who raise money by private donations and who also make money by loaning out their inmates to factories for wages, become the normal operator for these types of institutions. But because it's a public service that they provide, when, for instance, a poor house or an orphanage that is privately run takes somebody in, the law sends them to them, they also become inmates. So it's a private prison system and a private charity system in one. Many people who are inmates of these institutions, in which they end up because they are impoverished as a result of the market, of the labor market, are then forced to work for little or no wages, making things that could have been made by people working for wages who are not imprisoned or otherwise institutionalized. So at that end, these institutions contribute further to the cause that got people into them in the first place by depressing wages and eliminating paying jobs. All the same, they are making people for whom they work as forced labor richer. So these are some of the examples, and you see that at work in the sources we're reading, as well as to some extent in the movie Gangs of New York. These are some of the ways in which government makes sure that you have a sufficiently needy working class that will work for low wages. On the federal level, on the state level, and on the local level. The poor, the people, those who are doing all the actual work, pay at multiple fronts, whether it is through taxes, whether it is through the inmate labor, whether it is by being criminalized and sent to jail for vagrancy or petty debt. And all of that rests on legislation, on law enforcement, on a political and legal system that is set up to skew the system in favor of the rich and powerful. the profits all accrue at the top. To the extent that people do make a living out of this, they have to spend their income on a free market for rent that goes to developers and landlords, and for daily needs that also end up making somebody rich. So there is no possibility here to work yourself up, because there is never a point where you would actually put money on the side. You're always going to be running just short of your budget. And all the risks that are inherent and that certainly aren't individual in any meaningful way, like illness, unemployment, and old age, all of which will hit people with some degree of inevitability, regardless of whether they've led a productive and godly life or not. That is individualized. You're stuck with that. But the benefit of your health, of your alertness, of your youth, and so forth, of your capacity to do labor, is spent to make somebody else rich. And government is playing an essential role in making that so. So to this day, many of the basics that I've laid out here, how did government make it possible to begin with, that you had capital and that you have labor, that you have concentrations of money in the hands of people who want to go into business, and that they find a willing and dependent workforce that will go to work for wages. Government makes that happen. Government puts these conditions in place. So when people say, should government be involved in the market? That is the wrong question to ask, because there is no market unless there is a government that is involved. And rather the question should be, when government inevitably is involved in the economic life of a country, whose side is it going to be? So, and of course, that is precisely the question that when in the next week, when we're talking about the political activities of the working class, Andrew Jackson, the Democratic Party, the working men's parties, that is the question that these newly enfranchised working class voters and activists are asking when government gets involved in economic activity, in the life of the market economy, whose side is it going to be on? And since this is a republic that belongs to the citizens, shouldn't it be on the side of the many, of the majority, and not on the side of the few, the handful of rich people who are so far reaping all of the benefits?